Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Meanwhile Here on Earth. This program features in-depth conversations with the leading names in the subjects of UFOs, abductees, the paranormal, panel discussions, and the very best and brightest of the next generation of writers and researchers. Meanwhile Here on Earth, the show breaking new ground in alternative talk with your intrepid host, veteran investigative writer and researcher, Peter Robbins.
Hello and welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth with me, your host, Peter Robbins. We're going to go right into our program for today, no monologue. And I'm particularly glad to have this guest returning to the show. My friend Doug Auld is a native of Queens, New York, like myself, and moved to New Jersey as a child, not on his own, with his parents. His love and fascination with nature and wildlife superseded his familial expectations to take over the family's Chrysler dealership. Though he prepared for it by becoming a proficient mechanic, he found himself in the last year of high school studying piano in classical music, eventually writing his own original music. After a brief time in the music industry, Doug took up an interest in painting after visiting the Salvador Dali Museum in Cleveland, Ohio. Though self-taught, Doug pursued art and painting, eventually taking continuing education courses at the Art Students League, one of New York City's greatest institutions, the School of Visual Arts, my alma mater, and where I was on the faculty of, and the New York Academy in New York City. He became a finalist at the Outwin Bolshevik, I'm probably pronouncing that wrong, portrait competition in 2006 at the National Portrait Gallery. In July of 2006, he received critical acclaim in the Washington Post and the New York Times for his artwork series inspired by burn survivors. Currently, Doug has done something absolutely phenomenal as far as I'm concerned. He has written a musical that he hopes to bring to the stage, ideally to Broadway. It's inspired by his own experiences and the experiences of notable friends in the UFO area. The musical is called HYPNOTTA, a word given him while waking from a dream state. HYPNOTTA intends to bring a UFO soft disclosure to the theater, which really would be a precedent, and to tourist audiences coming to New York City. It is about UFO contact, and a UFO contact event, and the human challenges and complexities the characters face in their plight to prove the event real. I'm going to give you these URLs at the end of the show again, but so you have them now. His art website is Doug Auld, and that's DOUGAULD.com. His UFO-related site is DougAuld.com/UFO. And the musical site is HYPNOTTA, HYPNOTTA.com. And without further ado, Doug Auld, welcome back to Meanwhile Here on Earth, my friend.
Hi, Peter. Thanks for having me, and you did a great job. And amazing that you said HYPNOTTA correctly the second time, because everybody makes that mistake and says Hypnotica. So I don't have a problem with that, but thank you very much for catching that. And I'm happy to be here.
It's a kind of the difference between looking at a word and actually reading it. And occasionally, even if you are used to reading scripts like this, the mind just short circuits itself and goes to the obvious error and ignores the fact that it's not spelled that way.
Yes.
Time plays such tricks on us, and I think a lot of it really was exacerbated by the pandemic. It feels like I haven't seen you in a month or two, but it's been years at this point, 5 years or longer. But that's the way it is sometimes when you connect with people and the friendship is real and delineated. there are so many things about your creative and professional path that dovetail into the life, the works, the logical progression of other artists, experiencers, technically minded people that I know, but no one who brings it together in such a unique way as you. Um, I'd like to begin with just kind of a reflection on your childhood. It was, from what I remember, a very sound one, a loving one, and there was this logic that you were going to become the owner of a Chrysler dealership. I mean, why mess with perfection?
Well, by the way, I'm still in that childhood, so I've never really grown up. And most of the stuff, when you read the things that I've done, it's almost like, and I don't flippantly say this. It's almost like I don't belong being able to do any of this. It's like a hard thing to explain how I jumped from one stone in the pond to the next without, drowning. Always very mechanical as a kid, always taking things apart, putting them back together. I was born in the 50s. So, I didn't know what was supposed to be or not be and what I should know or not know. And I still don't. Nature, going down to the golf course and picking up golf balls and putting them in my bag and selling them back to the golfers. And catching turtles and frogs and snakes and wildlife and bringing it home, and my mother putting them in jars, and in my bedroom were like jars of tadpoles, and then there was a snake, and there was like, my mom had fits, but it was a beautiful upbringing. But my dad was very much the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain that I got to see on Sundays, Saturdays and Sundays. And when Puccini arias were playing in the house and Rachmaninoff and this grand music that I never realized would ever affect me to the way that it did, being exposed to it. And so that was kind of getting out of the gate as a youth. And since my dad was bringing home cars, and I was like, oh, these are the coolest things, like a Roadrunner and a Barracuda, Plymouth Barracuda. What a cool car. I took an interest. And then my father, who was a conservative, would be viewed as a raging liberal today because he allowed the tow truck to drop off a huge car engine, a Hemi engine, on our driveway for me to work on, oil and everything on the floor. My mother. My God. And when I look back, I wouldn't allow my kid to do that. But so I had a mechanics upbringing, and I very much saw the world through like problem solving, figure it out. This goes into that, and if it doesn't, try it this way, and on and on and on. And everything has carried its way through the years like that, including I'll bring in the idea that I'm 45 years of ice hockey playing, and ice hockey playing in my mind is synchronizations of great moments. And there's me 3 years ago. And the idea that like magic aligns in sports, where like you send a pass and three guys are trying to stop it, and it goes right past the stick at the right time to be picked up by someone else. And I think in terms of that all the time, even the Copa soccer that was on that I followed was amazing.
It occurs to me, looking back on my own life and the lives of a lot of creative people I've gotten to know over the years, it's almost like inquiring creative human beings spend a good part of their lives being pulled between their natural attraction to nature and to culture. And for me as a kid, it was, spending time in natural areas. But growing up in New York City, it wasn't until I was 7 and moved out to a little village on Long Island that I really had a fuller experience of nature. But went to New York City regularly and went to museums. Were museums a part of your life as a kid? Because growing up in Jersey, you certainly had access to New York, and Jersey has its own, great set of museums.
Marginally, and I'll have to say something in honor of my brother Greg, my older brother. He was the one. He's like 2 years older than me now. He was the one that kind of broke ground in my family. So like he went up against all the difficulty with my father with breaking ground. And I somehow, like a stock car on a NASCAR track, I slipped behind and got pulled through. So there was less scrutiny on me the second time around. But my brother is the one who introduced me to music by taking me to a Doors concert in Philadelphia. And that's what changed my life. I was in auto mechanics school. And he's like, hey, pack something. We're going on Friday to drive into Philadelphia to see a band. I'm like, who? He's like, the Doors. I'm like, okay. Right. And I got to see that and Jim Morrison and the whole thing. And that made such an impression on me. When I came home, I said, oh, that's so cool. I think I'm going to buy an organ. And like, nothing stopped my thought process of I can do that. But to answer your question about museums, no. But my brother now starts painting first. And he's painting, and I'm watching him, watching him. I'm like, I can do that. I'm thinking, I can easily do that. If he can do it. And he ended up taking me to the Salvador Dali Museum. At the time, it was in Cleveland, Ohio. And I've got the Doors in my head on one side of my creative side, and I'm looking at these great paintings. These like imaginative paintings, but not only imaginative, he was a great painter. He could pull it off.
Yeah.
Well,
And I'm going to jump in here and just ask you a painter's question, which Dali's work is kind of a cross between the outrageous, the unusual, the surreal. Of course, he was a surrealist. But as a technician, he was really in the Jan van Eyck school of, one hair at a time. Were you initially drawn to the subject of his compositions and their complete dreamlike or, surrealness, or his technical proficiency as a painter, or both to some degree?
It's a good question. It was certainly both. But I think, first of all, my criteria as a person, like I'm a Virgo, all right? I'm like a logical, if you're going to paint your friend Joe, it better look like Joe. If it doesn't look like Joe, then you didn't do a good job in my mind, even though it may have been an amazing, quote unquote, interpretation. I didn't like the terms interpretation because it just, to me, gave the excuse for someone who couldn't do something well to say, well, that's how I meant it to come out, So Dali satisfied all those parameters because I knew he was like his hallucinogenic toreador. I was like, I see the toreador, I see the bull fighting arena, I see the bull, I see the whole thing, but I see a whole other world of imagination that if he took a photograph of that and showed it to me, it would be like, all right, I get the narrative, but I don't see the world that he was thinking. So he satisfied all these issues for me.
Another painter's question. After you were introduced to the work of Dali, did you come upon, at some point after, the work of the Belgian surrealist René Magritte? And if so, Magritte dealt with wonderfully surrealist themes and imagery, but his painting style was much more mannered, lower key. He was not interested in that sensibility of look what I can make the brush do, as much as here's a picture. It's rendered in the way that it is, but the thing to look to is not so much the technique, but the images. Do you remember coming upon his work by any chance after Dali? Again, a painter's geeky question.
No, not at all. And I discovered Magritte and Yves Tanguy and all these different surrealists after Dali. So Dali got me in the pool, and then I started to look at others, and I saw Magritte, and I think it was a big apple in a room, like it's like a setting that shouldn't belong. And I think it was even Magritte that said in one of his paintings, he said, sometimes a cigar is just a cigar. And I always remember that. But yeah, now, did I like Magritte? Yes. But I think to get me so compelled and get me into it, Dali's craftsmanship. And then I read Dali's 50 Secrets of Incredible Craftsmanship, something like that, the book. I forget the title of it. But, you know, he did some wacky things. Like he put a wasp inside his painting medium, and the wasp, he would tell the story that the wasp would help the painting medium do something. Now, I don't know if it was complete BS, but it caught my attention. I'm like, oh, how interesting. How did he discover that? And it could have just been that it made the medium thicker and slower and it's drying or something, which other things could do. But I just got that great image of Dali catching a wasp and putting it in the little jar, and like, who thinks of stuff like this? So Dali was the one who got me involved. Magritte was a very big influence. Tanguy and all these different surrealists that were basically trying to say, look at our so-called reality differently than what we're looking at.
Doug, were you taking books out of the library or building your own library, or where were you coming upon these painting images? It certainly wasn't from, your parents per se. Where were you starting to seek out these images that you were being inspired by?
Yeah, I pretty much think so through my brother Greg. If he had some books, then I looked through them and I got more books. And I remember being very moved by the Russian realist painters who I got very involved with. All right. Krimskoy and Ilya Repin. And and I always have, this is an interesting thing, I've always had a very deep connection to Russian culture. Yeah. And don't ask me why. I mean, I play ice hockey with a whole bunch of Russians, but that's it. I absolutely loved Rachmaninoff in the music vein. Rachmaninoff was my favorite composer. Tchaikovsky, Scriabin, and these Russian composers, but the painters, and something about the longingness and the melancholy and the sadness of scenery. And obviously Rachmaninoff, what is Rachmaninoff's Third Piano Concerto, a very melancholy piece of music, a longing for something that I didn't quite really identify with in my safe home in America.
Yeah.
And that spoke to me.
We come to similar passions by different paths. I'm primarily Russian American, and my art school education was preceded by several years of studying art at university. And I had years of classical figure drawing, drape drawing, different kinds of painting technique classes. You did as well in your own self-assigned life. You, for me, embody a creative artist who is self-taught, who gets to a point in a certain type of style or material, and then thinks, I can do this if I want, and I can do it better if I want. But now I think I'm going to move off over to here and explore this area some, and that may take me over here, etc. I've never thought of this parallel before, but if a creative person began their life focused on, to a degree, the mechanics of the manufactured universe, everything from an alarm clock to a toaster to more sophisticated things, one comes to appreciate a certain precision that exists in the world of machinery, and that it has to be a certain way or it won't work. Tolerances and, the size of little gear wheels. And do you in any way even allegorically see your understanding of mechanics and its own perfection in a way somehow taking you into the kind of painting that you enjoy doing most. And I also will say, I have a great affection for a lot of the post-revolutionary art, not the super socialist realism that was akin to the National Socialist, art that labeled all expressionists and in any way deviant from real life as degenerate art. You, how can I say, that area of romantic imagery, just the subtlety of an expression on a face, again, pre-revolutionary, czarist, the kind of shirts that men used to wear, loose-fitting, kind of blousy, that was always something that amazed me at how well certain artists could capture the fold in linen, that kind of thing. Was it that way with you?
Yeah. First of all, my favorite subject whenever I would go to a museum was a singular portrait. I always just loved looking at one face.
Yeah.
Now, not to say that, these grand paintings and of court scenes with like marriages and everything weren't like absolutely incredible. But I always felt that a individual portrait, just like there's an Ivan Kramskoy portrait of this guy leaning over a table with books, where he's looking at you, and it's so intense and just so the eyes are so dilated. This is the kind of stuff that captured me. Did I like to take on challenges of painting things such as reflection, transparency? Well, my whole tools painting series, those very photorealistic portraits of tools, is, Peter, a perfect example of me bringing my auto mechanics past into my art today.
Yeah.
And I said,
I absolutely agree. And even the relatively small amount of work of yours I've seen, which is dozens and dozens and dozens of paintings, still is a drop in the bucket compared to your life's output. But you have gone from one pronounced style of painting to another at different points in your life. And then with the series that, I'm not going to understate it, I think it's really life-changing to observe your series of people, portraits, who have survived horrendous burn injuries, who in some cases, had it happened even a few years earlier, certainly would have died from their injuries, and how that brought you into the world of these people, and how that brought the art world, in a way, into an awareness of these people they would have never connected with through your paintings. There's nothing kind of condescending or intellectual. You're right there with these people. And at the same time, I remember that period in my life, not to the degree that you mastered it, but of painting realistically. And when I was beginning my journey in the art world in the later 60s, there was this major school centered in Lower Manhattan they were called super realists or photorealists. And that's what they did. And it was a huge part of the market for a while until, I guess, the novelty wore off a little bit, and folks were more interested in what was coming from that or the alternatives. I want to go back in time a bit, though, because once again, you are a particularly multifaceted person, not just in your life, but in the formative experiences that made you who you are. You not only have an intellectual interest in the subject of UFOs and their implications for humanity, this is something you know close up and personal. Can you tell us about your first awareness of the subject, whether or not it was something specifically was an experience, or learning about it from some source, or how it began, your involvement in this subject?
Yeah. As far back as a kid, I just remember my brother and I, and I'll mention my brother Greg a lot because he was that person ahead of me. We would just like live for the outer limits and the Twilight Zone. And I often tell people, I think Rod Serling is one of the greatest writers and creators to teach a morality, a social responsibility, a morality. Most of his episodes in the Twilight Zone were about karma, do the right thing, what it's like to be aging, noticing the little guy, so-called, the idea that people are famous and not famous, or strong or not strong. He picked on so many topics, and I really do believe, although my mom and dad were good people, I don't really think I got the sense of morality like I got from the Twilight Zone. I mean, watching it every night and watching every episode 10 times over up till, only a few years ago.
I couldn't agree with you more. And my family, as a family, I think it was on Saturday nights at 8, if I remember correctly, that was one of the shows during the week that we watched. My sister Helen and I enjoyed The Outer Limits and some of the other stranger shows, but the Twilight Zone, for many American families, became an institution. And Serling, I mean, you could just throw superlatives at the guy all day. Several things about him stay with me, though, always. He grew up in New York State here, and right. For many years, the last part of his life, lived in a town called Interlaken, a few towns from here, and taught creative writing at Ithaca College, just up the road from here. Every year, there is still a Rod Serling Twilight Zone. I don't know if it's called a festival at the college, but his wife, Carol, who I think has passed now, was always a part of it. Actors who are still alive. His daughter, I think, still is a part of it. They screen old kinescopes of the show. One thing, though, that informed a lot of perhaps the underpinning of the morality that you talk about, during the war, he saw combat in the South Pacific, one of the most hideous, horrific, terrifying, I'm sure, areas of combat in history. And it's an understatement. And those of us that have never been in the military in combat, it's almost inappropriate for us to speak it because we have no idea what we're talking about. But he was haunted by some of the things that he saw that happened to him, dealt with them directly in a few episodes. In terms of Japanese soldiers, American soldiers, the carnage of war. But I would guess that it had a tremendous impact on his sense of morality, which came through in everything that he did. Also, he was really one of the godfathers of putting in the mind of the Western viewing public this whole idea of visitations from parts unknown by intelligences that we can only guess at their motivations. And those episodes that were overtly, extraterrestrial or UFO related were among the popular favorites. And of course, are classics for a lot of us in the work.
Well, so as I'm watching them in the Twilight Zone, in the Outer Limits, and I'm growing up on the original Godzilla, not the new ones, the original 1954 Godzilla, which was so impactful to me, not only the movie, but the great music composed by Akira Ifukube, who made a huge impression on me. And then you jump over to King Kong and Max Steiner, the writer of that music, and you take King Kong and Godzilla and Puccini and Rachmaninoff and all this music that I wasn't really aware that it was sinking into me. And that's how, as we move forward into my life and my own music and compositions, that music all has its bloodlines to my music.
And let's not forget Carmen Dragon and the amazing score from The Day the Earth Stood Still.
Yes, yes. Yeah.
Just thinking about it, and the creative use of the theremin in a way that had never been so effective at all. These things coming together with you at the Matrix, at some point in your life, was it informed by an experience or a UFO sighting or something that became another turning point in your life?
Well, when I look back into if there was any so-called paranormal events into my life, I've discounted one for many, many years that I've only been later in life starting to look at again in my mind because maybe I didn't really understand it. And it has to do with one of the most frightening nightmares anyone could have. And I remember I was in an Annunciation Catholic school, which with the nuns and everything, which could be a basis for a nightmare to begin with. And I remember this little, I swear, when I was sleeping in bed, there was a little green being on my wall that I would swear was Sister Mary Daniels, the nun that was in my school, who scared me. And she was a little thing, but man, she could straighten your knuckles out with a ruler. And I had that nightmare was so riveting to me that I think I had to sleep in my parents' bed for weeks, that I did not want to go into my room. And it took me a lot to get in there. And I always just saw it as a nightmare. And so as I fast forward into my life, I look back and I wonder, now knowing a lot of experiencers, talking to a lot of people and hearing similar stories, how do you know? How do I know? Now also, as a young guy, my brother Greg and I were out on the front lawn in Paramus, New Jersey, and it was dusk, and we saw a UFO. And we saw this like oblong, footballish looking thing that had like a red and a green top and a bottom. And it was sitting there, and Greg's like, look at this and look at that. And I'm looking at it, and he's looking at it. And then I don't remember anything else, but Greg said it turned on its side and shot away, which immediately eliminated the blimp or like a idea, whether it was an airship or air balloon or something. They don't tilt and then take off like a rocket ship. And that's what it did. And we've been trying to remember where I was in that time frame, and I don't remember it at all. He said, maybe you went into the kitchen, but I don't remember. So there's a few things that I'm left with, but I want to make sure the audience knows I do not like to exaggerate things into something they're not. And I'm very pragmatic. I am very pragmatic, and I'm very, very rooted in things. If it is, it is. Like I take UFO pictures, and that I have UFO pictures, and they're going to be in this chapter of this new book we'll talk about. Okay.
Yes.
If someone proves, remember, hello everyone, UFO, unidentified flying object, not little green man, not this, not that, unidentified. If someone can identify it for me, I'm like, thank you. There's another one I could scratch off my list, and now it isn't. So I really do think that we need to practice this kind of scrutiny and an honest look in the things we do. A lot of times you want it to be something, but it isn't, and you need to come to terms with that, And so I'm fine with eliminating them off, but the ones that I've kept to this day are ones that not only UFO researchers have looked at, but some high intel people in our government have looked at, and everybody has shook their head. And let me add one more thing, Peter, before you add something to this, is that the witness and what the witness saw from start to finish is so important to a photograph. Because if I just photograph a dot in the sky, and Grant Cameron and I talk about this all the time, like, who cares about, a dot in the sky? Yeah, I do if the dot in the sky is sitting still and then takes off at 1,000 miles an hour. Then I care about it. Or if it comes like this, stops, and then shoots like that. So it's the behavior, it's the timing, is there any sound, and all that stuff that goes into a good UFO sighting. And sometimes a witness description is even more important than a photograph.
Yes, you're right. And it strikes me yet again that your background in mechanics, in the real physical 3D world, in how components interact with each other is really a wonderful grounding for investigating the non-standard, the paranormal. You have a set of values and an understanding of how the analog universe
Yeah.
works, and that ain't a bad place to start. Um, I wanted to ask you, as you became passionate about painting and painting yourself, um, did you immediately let the people closest around you know that you were painting, or did you work quietly for a period of time before sharing your work with anyone? And if so, were their reactions to it instrumental in your continuing or causing you to hesitate?
Yes, good question. Well, of course, I think the first portrait I ever painted was from an album cover of Cat Stevens. And I went, all right, I want to try to do this. So let me use my common sense and do it. And I did it. And I made that painting. Um, it's either the first one was Simon and Garfunkel or Cat Stevens, but I did two. And I remember coming upstairs and going, what do you think of this? To my mother and father. And they were like, where'd you get that? I said, no, I painted it. And they were like, what the heck?
Oh,
How the hell did you learn how to do that? And I'm like, well, I don't know. So, so a lot of it, I really kind of took for granted. You know, I have there's a woman I haven't been in touch with for many years, but her name is Dr. Suzanne Mendelson. Really brilliant woman who lived out on Long Island, and she knew me for a period of time, and we just fell away. But she always said something to me. She said, Douglas, you have no idea how blessed you are to be denied an education.
My first reaction is you had so much that you didn't have to unlearn.
Yes.
I was very fortunate again in that, like most art students, you learn this, you learn this, you learn to work in this manner, you learn to work in this manner. But at a certain point, the understanding is now that you've got this under your belt, you can master it or you can blow it off and let it go and move into the realm of non-objective or abstract, completely your choice. It was important that you know how to do these things first. Now, that's not always the case. I look at one of my favorite modern painters, Frank Stella, who died just a couple of months ago, and his heroic, huge geometric paintings from the late 60s and late 50s and into the 60s that absolutely blew my mind when I first saw them. And they didn't have anything to do with shading or, careful composition
Right.
or line work. And we can have passions for these things at the same time. I'm thinking, though, your parents' reaction of, what? That's a wonderful reaction to inspire you in moving forward in your work. It's like, whoa, that was completely unguarded from the grown-up world, and something I did really. I could do this. I am doing this. Um, Also, the excitement of knowing you can teach yourself, something many people never know, never learn. And I think of all of the professional, middle-aged, for lack of a better term, adults I worked with over the years in the School of Continuing Education as a night school teacher in a painting class that's conceit was, I will teach you to paint in the manner you want to paint, in a room full of other people that I'm working with kind of as private tutoring sessions. And it was a great energy. But often the story was, I'm a banker, I'm a lawyer, I'm a doctor, I'm a successful professional. But when I was 7, 9, 11 years old, my cousin, my aunt, my friend came up behind me while I was drawing a turtle and said, that's the worst hippopotamus I've ever seen in my life. And I never drew or painted again. And I want to learn. And I'm not exaggerating that unexpected and hurtful not necessarily meant as such, piece of criticism killed it or damaged it
Well,
tremendously. And you didn't have that. You basically, you started to explore.
you know what happened? I had an interesting combo with my mom and dad. My mom was super loving. So here's an abundance of love. Douglas could do no wrong. It didn't matter what I did. Oh, sweetheart, that is wonderful. Okay. So think about that, which is like such an amazing advantage of over so many kids in different walks of life. Okay. And I'm always appreciative of that. But then I had my dad, who always had this question:
Chrysler dealership.
did you sell it? So I'd be like, well, no, Dad, but and then he'd just turn and walk away. So I had an interesting thing that was up against me at all times. My mom saying, go, go, go. It's beautiful. But
Goods
me,
and services. You've done
yeah,
something, you
yeah.
need to be paid.
But my mother, of course, being in the category of a dreamer in my mind, not in the real world. My father's working out in the world. She's home. She's taking care of us. And like, bringing in flowers and beautiful things. But then my father out in the world, and he's like, what good is it if you can't sell it? Because now my dad here, Peter, is a Depression era kid. He went to school at night and worked in the day. And for his boss, he looked over his boss's desk from behind it and read everything on the boss's desk upside down. And that's how he started to learn things that the boss knew that he didn't know. And so my father, it's not that he did any kind of fighting in the war or anything, but it was a Depression era. He had a rough dad, an alcoholic, the whole 9 yards. So here's my lovely little mommy and my kind of more rooted in reality dad. And I can't say that they did me any harm, because I did start to sell the paintings, and the paintings, by the way, me painting brought me into, oh, this is important. My auto mechanics and the switch into art brought me into, and music brought me into switching from being an auto mechanic to a piano tuner. And now I'm a piano tuner and a piano rebuilder, because the German fellow, Helmuth Dusedow, his name was, what a great man. He was such a mentor at that time. He came into my house and tuned my Steinway piano, which I bought at Griffith Piano Store for $6,500. That thing's probably worth $100,000 or
Oh
over.
my God.
And Griffith, and he tuned my piano. And I said, I'm Mr. Dusedow. Where could I learn to tune pianos? And he said, well, you'll have to go to a school in Boston. And he had that thick, actually German accent. And he goes, well, I can't have you work for me. He goes, I could never pay you. I said, who said anything about pay? I said, I'll work for you for free. And who does that today? I know it's a different world. So he invited me to come to a town and start undoing the tension on a piano so that we could cut the strings out of it and remove the plate, remove the pin block, and remove the action and everything, so he could start to rebuild it. I did that for him free of charge for a couple of weeks. I think within 2 to 3 weeks, he was paying me. And I think within a couple of months, I learned to tune pianos.
Wow.
And that's not an easy trade.
No. There's no room there. It's not, there's no such thing as it's almost tuned.
Yeah. Which is most of the homes that I went into were almost tuned, But I'm not saying I was the greatest piano tuner in the world, but enough to get me by, and enough to then start to have me earning money without a 9-to-5 job. And this I would, out there in radio, YouTube land, I would say to everybody, was one of the keys to my ability to experiment in the way I did, is I was able to learn to make money and be home at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, so that if it was painting I wanted to tinker with or the keyboard, I had time. I wasn't burnt out. If I had gone into my dad's car dealership, I'm sure I'd be a multimillionaire, but I would have been working 9 in the morning to 9 at night, case closed. Yeah. So that's one of the key things to getting me into the arts. And then we could actually talk about how it segues itself, we were started to, into ufology.
Yes, that is actually a perfect place to move to. But before we do, I want to show one, no, two of your paintings, and then go back to this point. These are perfect examples of, as far as I'm concerned, your early work devoted to realism. And when I first saw this first image, I had to laugh because one of the jobs that I had kind of coming up in the New York art world was at different points in my life, I had simple agreements with the directors of different galleries down in Soho. At one point, about half a dozen at one time, I was the guy that would come in every 3 or 4 weeks, take down the paintings, pull the nails, fill the holes, repaint, and hang the new show. And at the time in the late 60s, one of these super realists was a painter named Ralph Goings.
Yeah.
And when I saw this, I laughed because he was, I guess, the first to kind of master, automotive detail, which I think for a certain part of the art audience is, I can relate to that painting. That took work, that took skill, that took time, that took hours, that's worth X amount of dollars. I get it. Not one of these crazy abstract or non-objective things with crazy designs around it. This makes sense to me. This is art I can relate to. And again, it's perfect. It's just wonderful example of what it is. And I'm even looking at, the embossed label, the logo on the exterior of the lighting protector. It's just great. And again, here we are. It's a realism about realism.
Gee, I wish you were my agent at the time. You all the good ideas right now. Yeah, I mean, awesome. Because I started to see the very tools that I worked with as art objects. I started to see them as little
beautiful things,
little gems and jewels and things, and like reflecting screwdrivers and transparency. And like people would say, but how did you do the chrome? Did you have chrome paint? I remember somebody asked me, do you have chrome paint?
When it's so interesting that for many people, they're unable to look at it and see black, white, and gray. They absolutely go right to the metal, and it's this phenomenal mystery. How did they do that? There must be some kind of chrome paint, but no.
it's a very legitimate question and a great question. It's like, but you see, and I relate all this to music too. Whenever I talk about art and painting, I talk about music and the piano, and I say low bass tones on your piano on up to the high highs, right? Notes,
black and white.
Right, are low dark tones on your palette to the middle, up to the brightest Naples yellow, on up to the bright titanium white. And so like they're the same. And John Singer Sargent always talked about something that made a very big impression on me, one of the greatest painters ever. And he said he paints out of the fog. So I'm like, let me think about that, out of the fog. So a good analogy is if your friend Joe is walking up the street on a foggy morning, rainy, foggy morning, and he's coming up the street and he has a red shirt and blue pants and blah, 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 you don't see that at the very first moment that you can start to recognize him. You just see a silhouette. And as he's getting closer and closer, that one tone grayish and that other tone grayish, as he's walking forward, one tone grayish starts to become reddish gray, one bluish gray. And as he gets close to you, you start to see the reality of what you're seeing. That's how I paint. I paint from the big blur. And I get rid of the white on the canvas. I take a paper towel and I rub out highs and lights and that's and darks and I squint. And when I see the general thing that I kind of want to start to make, I go for that. But you want to paint out of the midtones, and it's got social implications too. It's like not, if you're overly this way, or if you're overly that way, you'll lose your audience. You'll lose attention. The eyes get weary of too many brights. The eyes get weary of too many darks. You want to make a nice blend of things.
Amen. We're coming into our final 5 minutes here, but I want to continue to a degree. Talking about, again, what we were talking about a few minutes ago, how the whole UFO reality kind of slid into your life at that point, not necessarily informing the subject matter of your paintings, but your general philosophy, your approach to life, your ability to understand that there are different levels of reality.
I'm an O negative blood person, and I never really knew much about any of this blood stuff until I met enough experiencers. They're like, "Oh, you're Rh negative. You're like alien blood." I never really attributed too much of that. Somewhere along the line, I always knew we're not alone. I've always known it. Now, you could say that was from the Twilight Zone and the Outer Limits. It's beyond that. It became a passion, and it became I know we're not alone. It's impossible. It's illogical.
Yes.
It's just simply illogical. It's like finding an anthill on your street. You go outside and find an anthill and believing that's the only anthill on Earth. It's like,
isn't it amazing how that extraordinary level of human denial, it's almost superhuman, to absolutely reject a possibility because perhaps it stirs up your own anxiety, understandably, as possible, when even the most conservative astronomer will now, if begrudgingly, admit there are tens of millions, at least, of sun-sized stars in diverse galaxies with an Earth-sized planet about the same distance that we are, giving it the building blocks, depending on your point of view. If you're pragmatic, agnostic, the primordial goo that yields the first one-celled animal, or, the lightning of God that animates the divinity of life. But to simply say, no, we're it, I guess has fascinated me in a way, because are you kidding? How it's beyond any possibility of odds that we are completely alone in the universe. And yet the debunker, very different than a skeptic. We all need to be skeptics, and good ones, especially if we're kind of on the front lines like you and I are. But a debunker's mantra is, it can't be, therefore it isn't, therefore it must be something else. And my job is to pat you on the head and give you some idiotic explanation that I can live with, even though I know in my heart that I've still got a problem with this subject.
Well, to touch on something we touched on earlier, about my friend, Dr. Mendelsohn, who said you're lucky to have been denied an education.
Yeah.
I was never corralled into a thought process. So I was never cemented into thought process. Like, for example, I know there's a lot of MFAs and PhDs out there, and I'm not at all making a comment against them, but most of them cannot change a flat tire. And so, there's different ways of knowledge and knowing. There's different ways. It's the same thing with the analyzation of the universe. I personally, and I'm not going up against scientists, I simply don't buy the Big Bang Theory. Now, it doesn't mean it isn't true. I just don't buy it, because I think our consciousness creates matter, and it's our consciousness that envelopes out to create matter, so that the next new telescope that we invent that outdoes the new one that we just made, that outdid the last one that we just made, will keep seeing farther and farther into the universe, because it's our consciousness that's creating what we want to look for. That's where I'm at. And that's just how I see it, knowing that there is no matter. Everything is vibrational.
Yeah.
So, along the way, and we're going to talk about UFOs and a little later, I very much got involved in quantum physics. Not that I understand it, but I understand it to a smidgen, enough to know that there is no such thing as matter. Everything is vibrating and everything is at a vibrational level. And take it from there. I have more questions than answers, but that's where I'm at.
That's not a bad place to be, and not a bad place for us to go to break. My special guest, Mr. Doug Auld, myself, Peter Robbins. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. Stay with us.
This September 6th through the 13th, join with like-minded souls in the experience of a lifetime on the Royal Caribbean Ovation of the Seas as we travel from Seattle to Alaska. Internationally renowned researchers, investigators, experiencers, authors, holistic healers, contactees, spiritual luminaries will sail on an extraordinary voyage of transformation. This cruise will explore UFOs, alien contact, cover-ups, ancient mysteries, the paranormal, holistic healing, and spirituality. Experience engaging lectures, one-on-one sessions, private, custom-tailored excursions, and a nightly UFO watch. The cruise is booking up fast. Go to contactatsea.com and be sure to mention the UNX network when you book. That's contactatsea.com or phone 336-749-1219. That's 336-749-1219.
This is Margie Kay, and I'd like to say thank you to all of our KUNX show hosts, staff, listeners, and viewers for making us #1 on Paranormal Talk Radio.
While most near-death experiencers return to this plane of existence with alluring tales of their time spent in the presence of the divine, what happens when one crosses the veil into the afterlife, into the void? In the new book, Dying to Meet Them, Mindy Toutfest describes her journey to the afterlife after a devastating aneurysm, how a strange turn of events would lead her to spiritual growth, divine healing, UFO experiences, and a greater understanding of the universe. Get your copy of Dying to Meet Them today at Amazon.com or visit unxmedia.com for more information on this book and more amazing selections from UNX Media Publishing at unxmedia.com.
and welcome back to this episode of Meanwhile Here on Earth with my guest, Doug Auld. Peter Robbins here. And before we were interrupted by our break, we were talking about one of the biggest subjects in the world, perception of the universe. That's pretty loaded. Let me jump back in with this image and ask you to tell us about it.
Okay. So these are some of the daytime images that I've captured myself with my either iPhone or camera. And people go, how do you see these things? And I go, I look up. So, you have to look.
Yes, that's how it begins.
It all begins by going, oh, holy crow. I don't know why I have such a keen eye for any aberrant object in the sky, but I do. And there's a whole aspect to this topic that I think consciousness dovetails into. But excuse me, let me say that top image, I don't know if you want to go back to it, but I was going to go through it.
Yeah.
Okay. The top left image, the little like black thing with the, all the way up, that was like so high in the sky. It was hard to imagine how I saw it. I got the iPhone out and I made a little film of it. And that was like one of the clearest sections, and I enlarged it. And that is like this manta ray UFO. You can see two protruding turrets, if I may say, coming out of the front of it. I've never seen it before, and I've showed several people, and someone said, oh my God, you captured the manta ray, and they had seen it too, or whatever. Okay, that was that. Directly below it was one of the oddest things. I was coming home from hockey in the morning, and I looked up, and there's I have a compilation of 6 images of that. And we talk about the tic tac of today. All right. Every image, that object looked like a star in the daytime sky. That's all it looked like. And I brought my telephoto lens out, ran inside and brought it out. And when I zoomed in on it, I realized it's not a stationary star, but it was a stationary object that was changing configurations. And those little oblong kind of like squarish round circle things, they were moving out and attaching in, and moving out and attaching in a whole bunch of photographs. The one in the middle is probably one of the most remarkable ones, because I showed that to my friends in the DC area, and they were both pretty much taken with it. It came out of nowhere. It didn't fly into the area that it was in. It appeared like a smudge of smoke, so I call it the smudge UFO. It appeared. I had 4 shots of it. It appeared, and it dissipated and disappeared. And so it was almost like it poked itself into the fabric of our reality and then back out again. But you can obviously see it has a geometry to it. So,
very much so.
The one far right was the most spiritual, if I may say, one, where this orb floated over the top of me. I was sitting on my church steps, only because they're next door to me, my church steps. And I was sitting there with my camera, and I beautiful clear day, and I saw this white object slowly floating over the top of me. It stopped directly above me. I took several photos. It was like a pearlescent, beautiful orb. When I looked down the camera to adjust it, look back up again, it was completely gone. And it gave me the feeling of, as wacky as it will sound, it gave me the feeling of an angel. It was like an angel or a guide or a spirit being that said, we know you're there. And then the one below it is only one image, and I can't, there's not enough to show, but it was a funny UFO thing because I called it God's business card. It was like a square white card in the jet lane. As the jet lane, the jet stream, the planes were going past,
Yeah.
that went past, and I spotted it, and I said, "Wait a minute, is that a plane?" And I zoomed in on it, and I got a bunch of photographs of it, and that will be
Yeah.
in the upcoming book that I have the
Good.
chapter in.
Yeah, we'll be talking about that. It's one thing to begin to study the subject of UFOs, UAPs. There are so many different areas of study that one can get involved in. It's another thing to reach out and make contact with somebody who is known or distinguished themselves in the field. At what point did you actually reach out and make contact with somebody in the field, and who was that?
I believe if this went correctly, I met Chris Bledsoe, and I called Chris Bledsoe. I was watching Veritas Radio with Mel Fabregas, and I was watching that show, and he had Chris on, or either on an interview. I wrote Mel and said, "Hi, I'm a guy that likes to follow this stuff, and I'd love to speak to this man, Chris Bledsoe. Here's my email. It would be wonderful if you gave it to him." He did. Chris wrote me. We became immediate friends, and he invited me with his wonderful family, and I went out and I stayed with them several times over several years. We walked down to the Cape Fear River together. I photo documented everything that he told me about. I listened to his son's testimony. His wife at the time, she was wonderful. She's like, "I don't believe half this crap." So it wasn't like she was totally on board. Everybody wasn't in concert on board. And Chris was shaking. I could see him, tears in his eyes, and he had goosebumps and everything like that. Anyway, Chris somehow put me in touch with meeting Grant Cameron. And I went to a UFO event in South Jersey that Grant Cameron was at, and that's when I met Grant in person. And I had actually shared all my all my on-site Cape Fear River photos of Chris and the description of the sighting with Grant. I gave them all to him. I was like, and I don't charge anybody for anything. I'm like, to me, this ufology field, I just don't charge anybody for anything, and anyone can have my photos. And in the book that it's coming out in, which is called The Beings, which we'll talk about, I don't have any copyright on them. Take them, and if you can send one to someone in California and they say they saw the same thing, all the better, because then we can all learn about this. So it was them then, of all interesting twists. I met on a blog, on like a Zoom call of like 10 people. I met Dan Smith, the physicist that was friends with Ron and Aaliyah Pandolfi. Ron is with the agencies, so to speak, and they became. And I went out to see them, and I was, what wonderful people. They treated me like gold, and so now I'm in the pool of like this whole thing. And then I started to meet this one and that one, and write to them, and people got to start to know me. I knew, and I don't remember in this chain of events, Peter, when you and I met. Do you remember? No. I don't remember what stage. Was it after Grant Cameron or before?
I certainly knew Grant for years, probably before you did, and remember a particular conference where he really took the top of my head off. Grant, who is Canadian, and came into the work as the go-to scholar on any aspect of the UFO subject and the presidency of the United States. The joke was he's Canadian, and he knows more about this than any of us. He wrote about it wonderfully, and again spoke about it for years at conferences. And then at a particular conference, he basically just said, "I'm not going to be talking about my usual subject. I'm going to be talking about UFOs and consciousness." And I remember at that moment going, "Wait, listen." And off he went. And Grant has one of those minds wired up to his ability to communicate, and a particular enthusiasm that can make him literally hypnotic to hear. he will go on and expound ideas, often very complex ideas, for prolonged periods of time that make perfect sense if you can stay with him. And he is now really a champion of the subject of UFOs and consciousness. You really did connect up with two remarkably significant figures to start with. And I think in good faith, we should tell folks a bit about how Chris Bledsoe became involved. And well, first, I agree with you. He is a great guy. I've never met anyone else in his family, but have a sense of them. I met Chris years ago at a UFO conference, I think in Maine, and we have not been in much contact since. But his case, his claims have been so well documented at this point, and their implications are so sweeping that he really is kind of a class by himself. And a key aspect of his account is an event that happened on his property and ultimately involved a presence that has become a very real part of his life. You captured her in a painting, and this is the image, which has had a great impact on a great many people who have seen your painting, which is certainly out there in the world. Do you want to talk a bit about your understanding of Chris's story and how you came to paint this angel?
Yeah. So when I was visiting Chris and I would go to see him, as much as the original story that Chris told me down at Cape Fear River, fishing with a bunch of guys, Chris was in a very, very dark place in his life, health-wise and a lot of things. His son was down there with him, and he took a walk out of the Cape Fear River area where these, according to the story, I mean, these red orbs were coming down and everything was going crazy, and there's all sorts of strange UFO-ish type of activity that day. No matter what he told me about that story, he kept saying to me in times in weeks past, and if I went to visit him again, is, Doug, the lady is the message. The lady. He goes, and I know you're a wonderful painter, and it would be amazing if you could do the lady or paint the lady in some way. And I'm like, and Peter, you'll know what I'm saying. I'm a studio painter. I'm a painter that's someone will sit for me, or objects, or I'm not like I can't interpret someone's dream.
Yeah.
But this is a vision he had, and I, as best I could, put it together. Some of the posing in it and stuff, I had a little bit of help from a wonderful woman I was seeing at the time, Sarah. And, Sarah, stand up on the steps there and put your hands out. I needed to base this on something. And I created this painting out of his story. The tree in the background that was burnt out, the bull running at you, was how this started, where he woke up and he was told, arise, and he went outside, and there was wind blowing through the woods, as best I can remember, and a bull charged at him, ran through him, knocked him down, and when he turned around and kneeled on his knees, this lady was floating off the ground. Now you have a blocking bar at the bottom of this that doesn't show the full painting. I don't know if you can remove that. If you can't, don't worry about it. Yeah. It says you're watching. Oh, there you go. Oh no. Okay. So
yeah,
don't worry about it. But anyway, people can see that. And when we speak about the Beings book, all my art, these pieces are on my website, and they're in the new Beings book that will be released. But that's what I did. And it was not easy to do. It took me a lot of time and a lot of effort. And I painted it for him. Not in the sense that, here, Chris, now it's yours. I've kept it here all this time. Chris said, you've got a really, really, other than the face, he said, which just looked different. And I'm like, how could I ever how could I ever nail the face when I've never seen it? He said that whole thing really represents really well what that reality was like. She was floating off the ground. And of course, Chris has his book out now and is covered, and his son does a podcast, and I think they've spoken about it quite a bit.
Let's talk a little bit about the phenomena of the tree that enters into this story. As a person who is a pragmatist, there is something very unpragmatic about Chris's seeing this tree burst into flame, as I recall. And in the aftermath, I'm trying to remember the details. It has been a while, but that while it was put out, the fire came back repeatedly. Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, and I think this is a very true account of it. It did burn, and they put it out, and it came back. Now, look, depends on how you want to look at things. If you want to be a skeptic and a deep skeptic, you can kind of explain away anything almost. You can explain away anything. I'm sure many a house fire has been put out and then later it's smoldering again or this and that. But there's something different about this. And there was just too many working parts in my mind for Chris to, I don't know, fabricate this all, or, in collection and collusion with family and members. They weren't all on board as much as you think. They weren't. They were like Yvonne, his wife, lovely person. She was like, when I first met her, she was like, I don't believe any of this, So it wasn't like they were all trying to sell it. His son, Chris Jr., made a very big impression on me when he told me this. I didn't ask him about it. I was at the table, and he says, yeah, he told me the story. Very nervous, very upset. So one of the things that happened between Chris and I, we kind of had a falling out, but I don't really think it was a direct him and I falling out. It had to do with the fact that I told you earlier, I got introduced to the Pandolfis through Dan Smith, Ron working in intelligence, and Ron allegedly running the Weird Desk. I mean, the top position on ufology and so on. And Dan Smith was a little bit of an out of the box player and did some crazy stuff. And he went to see Chris on his own to kind of like rile Chris up and like, we know who you are and we're blah, blah, blah. Oh, it's the weirdest thing. But in the meantime, now Chris ends up being involved with Jim Semivan of the CIA. So it was like dueling CIA people between Chris and I, and it got so kind of chaotic that I didn't want anything to do with it. And Chris and I just kind of backed away from each other because one was paranoid about what the other one was saying, and vice versa. And that whole intelligence world is kind of out there. But anyway, all I can do is speak from my own experience, is that the Pandolfis have treated me like gold, and so did the Bledsoes. And that's where I want to keep it.
One thing I'll observe about Chris, for anyone who has any questions, he is a very successful contractor. And he is also a person, I don't know how else to say it, who is so unassuming, who really is very much a product of the basic, very real values that he was brought up with, that his professional success really, for me, has canceled out any consideration about trying to make a fast buck on a con. It's just not in his matrix there. Extraordinary things happen to regular folks, and ultimately it can make them extraordinary in the experience and what comes after the fact. As we go through the next series of images, mostly your paintings, I don't think they are necessarily in the order painted, but we will simply go through the narrative and establish as we go. Let's talk about this one and where this comes in your life.
Okay, well, this was one of my somewhat surreal images. And I have another painting I have a soccer player actually that is so cool. It's like all fish swimming in different directions, that at a distance, it looks like a soccer player is kicking a soccer ball. And I've always loved the idea of alignment and moments of time. Now, one of the great artists that I had a pleasure to meet over the years was Chuck Close. And I became
Yes. Yes.
Now, Chuck, if people know or Google Chuck Close, C-L-O-S-E, his amazing process work, which is what I call it. He got lumped in with the photorealist, but he really wasn't a photorealist. He was a person who liked to work in process, and he was a minimalist in a sense. So he never really, like if he was going to do a face, he didn't think that the eyes were any more important than the background over the shoulder.
Yes.
That's like visual information over there, and this is visual information over here. And then
Very hyper-specific painting philosophy, yes.
yeah, which was brilliant because it freed him from the narrative. He didn't want to be telling a story. Chuck was not interested in telling a story. But I always made a notation to myself. I said it to him once. I said, oh, and we had conversations about this, but I said, you know, Chuck Close makes a very, very high integral image out of what he called a dumb mark. A scratch, a fingerprint,
Yeah.
a dot, a blue, red, green, a little this, some hatch marks. And then you add them up over millions of them, and it's making this dazzling image. You cannot believe the realism of it.
It was something actually that he perfected following a profound stroke that would have taken another person and just took him out of the game.
Yeah.
He was semi-paralyzed for the rest of his life, had a high-tech wheelchair, but thankfully at that point in his life was successful enough to cover extraordinary expenses and the like, that he simply worked out this other way to paint. And I will say that he came to my attention as a idealistic young art student in New York in the late 60s with a series of 3 massive black and white realistic portraits. I think at least one of them was in that year's Whitney Biennial. And one was a self-portrait. One was a portrait of the modern Corten steel sculptor who died just a few months ago, Richard Serra, who was one of my inspirations and a teacher of mine at visual arts. And a third one of Philip Glass.
I actually have a Philip Glass portrait here, a print that Chuck gave me. So I have that.
And yes. I will articulate that because in the world of UFO studies, Philip Glass sounds a little too close to Philip Klass, yes. the arch debunker. Philip Glass went on to become one of our great heralded postmodern composers. And like a lot of us artists back in the 70s, we all learned trades. I was mostly a framing carpenter and did wallboard on more lofts in Soho than I could count. Philip was a plumber and a really good one. And we worked on several jobs together because you've got to get the walls up and the wallboard after the pipes go through, things like that. But those 3 paintings absolutely blasted their way into my consciousness.
So circling back to Chuck works on a grid. So what do we have in front of us? I said, wait a minute. Honeybees live in a natural grid system.
Yes.
So I'm going, and at the time, Michelle Roux of Absolute Importers here for Absolute Vodka. Of course, we had Absolute, Absolute Herring, Absolute Vodka, Absolute Warhol. You know, he learned about me and he thought my work was really fascinating. He said, Doug, could you do something with my bottle? Absolute bottle. So I said, okay, let me think about that. So I spelled with the honeybees. I made the bottle with the word ABSOLUT with the shot glass next to it. And it's just bees doing what bees do. So and then one's taking off out of the off the area.
That's great.
And I when I told Chuck that he makes a high integral image out of a dumb mark, I flipped it on his head. And what I did with my whole surreal series was make a lower integral overall image with a high integral mark. So my fish,
Well,
birds, and everything crossing each other and coming together, and my portraits of Marilyn Monroe and all that stuff can be seen on my website. There we go.
lovely.
So, and again, the farther away you get, the more it's a portrait of Marilyn. The closer you get, there are no lips. There is no nose. There is no eyes. They're just, you're seeing through a perspective of fish and sharks and underwater life.
And if you're not seeing it in the moment, squint slightly and it will come up.
And back up about 50 feet. But,
now,
yeah.
I want to prepare people a little for this next series of paintings because there's a saying that truth is beauty. Beauty is only skin deep. We have so many aphorisms for this. We human beings have such a preoccupation with the human form and, of course, most notably, the face. And if the face doesn't look quite right and it's disturbing to people in the Western world enough, these people who have such faces, often the result of terrible accidents or birth defects, are hidden away, in part for their own peace of mind, because an average person on the street will recoil. And so it is with burn victims. Why don't we see burn victims on the streets? Well, I guess for starters, and I'm making an educated guess, there's a certain self-consciousness of not wanting to be pitied or to frighten children or what have you, and more of an interior life grows, but it's still that person in there. And I want to know, for starters, how did you cross over into this world that for most of us, no matter how open-minded, no matter how empathetic, is just awkward and uncomfortable and brings up sadness, and you charged into it and you made a place for yourself in it, and you actually contributed to a general sense of acknowledging these people on a level they hadn't been. Where did this begin, Doug?
All right, I'll kind of speed through this in respective time for everybody. So hold this in your thought. Years ago, maybe I'm 18 years old, I went to an apple orchard and there was a commotion in the room, and everyone, as if a celebrity was walking through the room, and I was like, what's going on? And as this woman approached, she had a little girl with her, and I'm assuming that's some mother and a daughter. When the little girl got up close to me, she had curly red hair. She turned, and when she turned and looked at me, I just saw a melted person. I mean, she had no features. She had no nose, no ears. Everything was just drawn. And normally I'm very personable and hi, how are you, and everything. I was just taken. And she looked at me and I looked at her, and in a blink, she turned away. I walked out with my coffee and I felt really crappy, like, come on, Doug, you couldn't say hello or whatever. So I held that in my mind. I ended up spending some time in an island off of Belize, Key Calker, and I saw my second burned person in my life, facially burned. A lot of people are burned and you would never know it.
Sure.
And I went up to him. He was at a bar, and I went up to him, sitting by himself. I said, hi, how are you? Would you mind if I could join you? Because I had been there before and I wanted to kind of like undo a little bit of that. And we had a nice little conversation, and that was fine. It didn't come up anything about how he was burned. I just wanted to sit there and talk to him. Now, fast forward 9/11. I'm outside. I'm on my rollerblades in Hoboken, New Jersey, and I'm facing the World Trade Centers. And someone came out of the coffee shop I was at, and he said, hey, I heard a plane hit the World Trade Center. I'm like, what? Get out of here. Picked up my coffee, and I rollerbladed to the water's edge. Well, there it was, a gaping wide hole in the Trade Center, but only one at the moment. And everybody's like scratching their head. And I'm like, it's one of the clearest days I've ever seen. That cannot be
the weather was beautiful. I was only a few miles from you in Midtown.
Yeah, and the wind was blowing south. And I said, that can't be an accident. And I remember saying to somebody, wait, hold on. I think there's a rescue plane coming in. And I saw a plane on the side of me. And and I'm telling you to this day, and I know a lot of people are not going to want to hear this, it was not a passenger jet. It was a gray plane. And there's an investigator that he heard this and he really took note of it. And I'll think of his name in a second. Anyway, it went past the building and I thought it was just going to come around and surveil it, and boom. Now the second plane hits the building. Everyone throws themselves on the ground. People are crying. Somebody's going, we're under attack. We're at war. Yeah. Now, I rollerblade home late in the day. By the way, I saw both buildings fall. And my friend Kevin Cleary died in one of the trade centers. He was among so many people in this area.
Of course.
Get home on my rollerblades and my shorts, and I lay on my bed, and I'm looking at the ceiling fan. And I said, God, Doug, what the hell are you doing with your life and your talent? What are you doing? What are you doing? Futzing around doing this and doing that. And I said, you've got to do, life is fragile. You've got to take a stand on something. When I said that, that little girl that I saw in the apple orchard came back into my face.
Oh, my.
And so I often say, it chose me. The Burn Survivor Project chose me. Yeah. And I took the message and I said, wow. So playing hockey, I'm playing hockey with firemen and cops. And I went to Brian Green, my hockey player friend. I said, Brian, where would I find burn people? He's like, what are you doing, Doug? Are you crazy? I said, no, I got an art project. And he wrote down a name, Kathy Conlon, the St. Barnabas Burn Center in New Jersey. Contact her. I did. Long story short, I told them I wanted to do this project. They looked at my other art and realized it's not like, paint by number. I kind of know what I'm doing. And they invited me after a month of time of thinking about it. They invited me to come to the hospital. I sat with their chief surgeons and I described what my goal was. And they took 10 burn survivor volunteers to have their portraits painted. And that's how I did it. And now I went into, when I got those names and numbers, and I'll tell one story. This girl, Shayla, who was in the National Portrait Gallery, she's on my site. She was 14 years old, no fingers, burned, drawn, everything. Her brother accidentally dropped a cigarette lighter on her blanket, which was not fireproof. It was polyester.
Oh, my God.
And it stuck to her and everything. And her mother, Shayla, her mother, Vicky Voloshin, their name was. She was there, and I went to that family to hear, because I went to every family if I could to hear the real story. I brought photography and heard the real story, and I went to that household, and I remember coming to the door, my little car in a neighborhood I didn't belong in Edison, New Jersey. And I remember looking at the door and I saw this little face with his hand like this, no fingers. Hi. She was like, hi. I put my head back in the car and I cried my eyes out. I'm upset now for remembering it. That's how much of an empath I am. I remember that till this day. It got me so upset. I said, Doug, pull it together. I did. I went inside. And I took photographs, and Vicky, what a wonderful woman. She said, you know what? She said, all my Shayla ever wanted to be was a movie star and to be known and loved and a cheerleader and on and on. And would you know it, by painting that portrait, I was accepted as a finalist into the Outwin Bukover, that's the word, Outwin Bukover, portrait competition at the National Portrait Gallery in the Smithsonian, and her portrait hung there, and her mother, I called ahead. They were greeted by that entire museum staff and applauded for her being there. And with that, we went there, and it was just like so impactful. And that's one of 10 stories I could tell you about all the burn survivors.
Let's take a look at the 3 portraits that we have here.
Okay. Unfortunately, everybody can't see the full images because of this banner, but
Yeah.
you can go to my website. Now, this is how I met. This is weird. This is a girl named Maha Shaf. She was in Germany, and they learned about me through the New York Times article, and they told me that we have a burn survivor here that made national news because of what happened to her father when she was coming home. She was dating a Turkish kid, and her father was angry, and he threw gasoline on her, his own daughter, and lit her on fire.
Jesus.
And we exchanged information. She came here. I photo sourced her and talked to her and got to know her. I made the painting, and then I flew to Cologne, Germany with the painting, and they put me on German television with this portrait, and we presented it to her and the whole thing. Oddly enough, the interpreter there, young lady, was named Sarah, and Sarah became my girlfriend for a good 7 or 8 years, and she was the one who helped me figure out the modeling of the Chris Bledsoe portrait. So you never know who's going to do what and help you. But that series of paintings made such an impression on the art world. Remember when Velázquez painted the dwarf with the book? The dwarf, he was sitting down. Velázquez brought nobility to a little person, a dwarf, the way I felt I did to burn survivors. But I knew they had to paint them very realistically. If it was a junky job, nobody would have been impressed with them.
No.
So that's why I did and it's a series called State of Grace. That's Jelani Jeffries. Was in a house fire, saved his brother's life. And after he got his brother to run out the front door, he was trying to dial on the phone. As he's trying to dial the phone, his fingers are melting and the phone is melting. And he got the phone call off and then got back into the kitchen where he couldn't get out. And he jumped out the window and he broke both his legs on fire. And when I tell you that the biggest takeaway for me from all these people, they were the most noble, loving, unangry, unvengeful people. Jelani came with me to Boston to talk at the Spaulding Medical Center, and we gave their grand rounds together, he and I. So it's made a big impression in the world, and I think a lot of artists, I started to notice a lot of our young artists after this series was done and out, starting to take on mastectomy, amputees, and aberrant images of human beings. So it kind of helped to loosen up what we deemed as fitting for a portrait. And
here's the portrait behind you.
Yes. J.R. Martinez, that was called Back from Iraq. And I met him, and he was probably the most notable of the burn survivors. An amazing guy, and the largest burn survivor portrait I did. I think it was 60 or 65 inches tall. And I wanted to kind of finish off the series with that. And I think I went to a lot of the burn congresses. I met him there, and we spoke about the reality of being burned. Now, one of the things about J.R. Martinez, and this is something that I learned about burn survivors, is that J.R. Martinez is sort of still a handsome guy. He's a strong, handsome guy. Yeah. And it almost reminded me of like when I used to watch a movie like Death Wish with the actor. He was like a rugged guy, Charles Bronson. Yeah. Even though he had very pockmarked skin and rough skin. Yeah. The worst thing that you could be in our society is a non-symmetrical person, not burned, but non-symmetrical. Yeah. One part of the face is up, the other part is drooping, the eye is down, this is up. We really don't have much tolerance for it. And but I learned that. I learned a lot about that through reading several books on evolution, one being by Carl Sagan, that goes on in the animal world as well.
Interesting. And look at the character that you have captured in this extraordinary face. The article, not the Washington Post, but the New York Times article, was a featured piece in the Metro section, and I thought the Times handled it really well. It was a tremendously respectful treatment of your work, of the lives these people live, and of maybe getting us all a little closer to not flinching so much when we're presented with a face that does not fit into the category that we are comfortable with, to put it mildly.
I've always told people, look, nobody loves beauty better than me. Yeah. And the women, the beautiful women I've had in my life and the women I've dated, I'm going to plain old simply be honest with you. Beauty and beautiful faces and figures and everything are mesmerizing. Beauty is very powerful, but at the cost of what? At the cost of you hating your fellow man? I mean, at the cost of total rejection of other people? You're going to tell me you can't allow a person severely burned to be your bank teller or hand you a scarf at Saks Fifth Avenue? You know, you have to have empathy and put yourself in that position. And one of the reasons why burns was such a powerful topic for me is it was purely visual. This is not a disease. You don't touch a burn survivor and get the burn on your fingers, you know. You're not communicating with like disease oriented, I don't want to touch that person or be near them. It's simply that you're this way one day, you're in an accident, you're burned, and now you're a new way, and the same you is still there. But you can't be accepted by the world anymore. It's very tough.
Going on to, your sense of humor comes through in so much of your work, as well as your seriousness and your high intentions. And this is a perfect example of one that just caught me completely off guard, and my reaction was simply to laugh, being familiar with portraits of 16th century and 17th century formalist Dutch masters and the like. If you can't have some fun with this stuff, you're lost.
Yeah, you're in trouble. Well, I mean, and really it was just I made up the whole thing, but it was really the idea that if these beings, if we're being visited by other beings, whether they're microbes or actual grays or reptilians or this or that, it's not only since the 60s. I mean, this is happening in our history.
That's right.
And this is happening and running us back. Yeah, there's Linda and I.
You went on to do a series of 100 portraits of whistleblowers. And it's a very unified series. I'm so glad that in this case, you did not take your father's advice and sell them off. You have them all. It's an amazing collection. I'd like to think at some point in the future, in a post-disclosure era, they will have a permanent home at the Smithsonian or the National Gallery or wherever. But yes, a wonderful one of Linda. And this is to give us an idea of some of the folks, many of them extremely distinguished, that you have honored in this manner.
By the way, Peter, it wasn't my dad who didn't say to sell them off. You know who told me that? It was Stephen Bassett.
We're going to end with his the portrait in process. Steve is very practical, and looking for ways that we can fund ourselves as we move forward in the work and life. A pragmatist above all, and an idealist and a dreamer. And
it's a Jim Morrison portrait.
Yes.
And again, a great, you know what? And a little analogy that I used to like to play with myself, a little game within that school of fish. What do we have coming up on the bottom right is a great white. And what will that great white do? That's like an image of self-destruction. Morrison as an amazing being, self-destructive. And a lot of my paintings have these little narratives in them that most people would not know unless I explain that. But that's a cool idea.
My first thought, and paintings, films inform so much of our lives, and key lines by great script writers just become part of our internal dialogue. We're going to need a bigger boat.
Yes, absolutely. Jaws.
Now, this on the surface to a uninformed viewer, what's the big deal? This is really simple. I could probably do it if I wanted to. What is truly significant about what we are seeing here in this very special painting?
This is one of the rare paranormal events I had while awake. I was in Playa del Carmen in Mexico. I have a unit there my buddy John and I own together. And I invited my friend Charisse to spend a few days with me in Mexico. And she came and we went in and we were having a nice time. And laying late in the day on the bed, believe it or not, no hanky-panky, and she was a gorgeous girl, but we were laying there. And it was like such a beautiful feeling of everything. And I remember actually, I remember having this eye of, is she waiting for me to like kiss her or grab her? And I remember saying, yeah, I don't know, Doug, don't ruin the moment. All right. So guess I'm not aggressive enough. But anyway, when that kind of promise came into me, and this is like a 15-minute thing, as my eyes were closed, I started to see this image come into form in my head. And it was getting stronger and stronger to the point where I said, Charisse, I said, I'm having a weird thing. She's like, what? I said, listen, I'm seeing this thing. She's like, what? And I'd opened my eyes and look at her and it wasn't there. And I turned back and I closed my eyes and it was right behind my eyelids. If I opened my eyes, it wasn't there. But if I closed my eyes, and it got brighter and darker and stronger. And what it was basically was a almost like an Art Deco flower or rose or thing that was glowing, and millions upon millions of little increments were breathing in and out, breathing in and out, breathing in and out. It's like, it was amazing. And I'm like, what is this? And I watched it. I spoke to her all the way through it. And I said, it's starting to fade. And it faded out. And that was it. And when I came home, I took all my notes down on it. And I said, try to paint it. I mean, I didn't think I could. And I really couldn't. But that was the best facsimile of what I could make.
We're going to go through the remaining paintings at a fairly lively pace, so we have some time to talk about your musical. This one, again, a sense of humor. The painting is titled The Serial Killer. And rather than encaustic or watercolor or oil paint or acrylics, the medium you are working here in is, of course,
Trix cereal.
What else?
They're not just for kids. They're for...
Again, if we can, we have Mr. Ruby on the right edge there and a legendary sheriff on the left who became a friend of my friend Gus Russo, who's a Kennedy assassination researcher. So,
do you know Robert Morningstar? Peter?
To a degree, yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah, he's a very big JFK and researcher. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to like, and so here's this image, and it's almost like we kind of feed on these news stories and everything like that. But it's very sugary. And by the way, I ate about 4 boxes of Twix during that work. So I had my own.
That's even more impressive.
That's one of my painting walls with the burn survivors. Shayla is down in the bottom center with next to the angel. That was Shayla, the old girl. Okay. And I do want to make sure we get to the book and the
yes, we're on our way.
Okay.
You with Travis and with Chris.
Travis and Chris, right? And that was great. There's Grant and myself and
Mike.
Yep. Mike and Chris and myself. Grant and I always battling over my Montreal Canadiens and him. He's a Winnipeg fan. So this is actually one of my best paintings I've ever.
It's lovely.
It's a Vermeerish thing. Yes. 2 women in black outfits. It's called what's it called again? Hold on. It's called
Lady Cindy.
So Sister Cindy.
Oh, Sister Cindy, yes.
But the Cindy is Sindy, not C. It's just two women one woman looking into another's world, one woman out of religion and conservative values, looking into the world of a woman who's a model and a sex symbol.
Amen.
Same with this. This is the answer to that. The Science Times. My buddy sat there for me. I painted this from life, and I don't know how I did the newspaper. It's like one of the better things I've painted. One of my surreal pieces, meaning that sun and moon, wet and cold, same shapes, very different tactile experiences.
Chris, I have to apologize to you because I don't seem to have a copy of the book, but we'll go into that in one moment. Again,
I have it. I sent it to you on an email.
Yes, you did. And my apologies. I somehow didn't load it, although I'm going to try to do that as you talk about this painting and then just go into talking about the book. We're down to about 5 minutes, I'm sorry to say.
Okay, because I want to get that talking about the book and about HYPNOTTA.
Yeah.
This was the process of my whistleblowers. They were fast paintings. They were on panels, and I would rough it in on the left, start to hone in on it a little bit more, and on the right was the finished painting, although I have to admit to Steve that I gave him a black eye. I didn't quite put enough reflected light into that eye socket, but I can easily go back into that and fix it. But I moved on to other things. But that was my Stephen Bassett whistleblower portrait. Yeah.
And I think I'm just about to... let's actually talk about the musical for a moment, if you would.
Yeah, and you could go look for that photograph. That would be great.
Almost there.
Yeah, so HYPNOTTA is my show. I wrote it for soft disclosure through a Broadway or stage audience. I felt that I wanted to bring the idea of extraterrestrial life and its reality, not in a movie, not with special effects, but more like classic film It's a Wonderful Life, or more like A Wizard of Oz, where it was a beautiful story to follow. There was no violence. There was no special effects, because there's so much special effects today that are so dazzling, and everybody's anesthetized to them. I mean, we have special effects in a Maytag repairman commercial better than the best of movies 20 years ago. So to me, the only place to go is to pull back and to tell a story, and a little bit like puppetry and costuming and everything to do so.
Well, for whatever reason, it's simply not loading. I'm sorry about that. But let's, again, we only have a few short minutes left. Your musical, again, to create a full musical with songs, with libretto, with script instructions for staging, where did this come from?
Yeah, I have absolutely no business doing what I did. I'm 100% sure of that. But I got this image. I said the word. I woke up in the middle of the night and I said the word HYPNOTTA. I sat up and I said, HYPNOTTA. Where did that come from? Did I say that, or did that come from the other side? And I meditated on it. When I came home that day, I started to think more and more. And then all the music that I'm writing at the time, every time I would show my son Brian a song, he'd be like, yeah, or my brother Greg, they're like, yeah, geez, that sounds like show music. Doesn't sound like a rock and roll song. So forget the 40. And I said, you know what I'm going to do? And I made a promise. And when I made a promise, like the Burn Survivor series, I cannot tell you, Peter, how the answers downloaded to me. I said, I'm going to write a musical about disclosure. Nancy Tremaine, my dear friend, inspired my characters. Nancy and her friend Nancy and Cindy inspired my two main characters, Nectar and Jilly, in my show. And then the Ariel School sighting, Chris Bledsoe, and one other sighting inspired my patterning of my show. And I told this entire story. And when I tell you that 30 to 40 pages came out of it, as if it was water flowing out of me.
Yeah.
And I'm not a writer. I'm not, but I'm not a painter either. So go figure.
Well, you're not, but you are, and in spades. The songs, as somebody that loves the history of theater and somewhat familiar with the history of the Broadway musical, these are commercially viable, very clever, well-written pieces of music. I'll also say, if there is anyone out there watching or listening who works in the industry and is interested in learning more about HYPNOTTA, or possibly in staging it, it is an available property. All you have to do is contact me. I will put you directly in touch with Doug, and you guys go forward from there. Doug, I can hardly believe it, but we have blown through our 2 hours in about 40 minutes somehow. Listen, my brother, I miss you. A giant hug to you. Looking forward to being back in actual 3D communication at some point. And to paraphrase Arnold Schwarzenegger, you will be back on the show. And I'm already visualizing a panel discussion among creative people who paint and write music, etc. This is Peter Robbins. The show is Meanwhile Here on Earth. Thank you so much, Doug Auld, for being my guest, and we'll see you next week.
Thank you.